Thomas grew up in Orem and received her bachelor's degree and master's TESOL certificate from BYU. She followed this up with an MFA in creative nonfiction at George Mason University. And after receiving her degree, she taught ESL, English, and creative writing in Northern Virginia for a few years. Last year, she moved to Palo Alto, California, where she's a technical writer for IBM. And she's published poetries and essays in journals and newspapers, including Calliope and Dialogue. Thomas published her first book, Coal in Our Veins, last year. One reviewer commented that in this book, Thomas was able to transform lumps of coal into a page turner. The book began as the thesis for her MFA, and she traveled to Wales, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Utah as part of her research process for it. Research is always a significant part of her writing process. For the book she's working on now, she's researching ways to reduce asthma. She calls it a 6-month experiment to lessen the impact of asthma in 6 alternative treatments. And I look forward to reading it. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Erin and Thomas.
It's really great to be back here at BYU with all of you. As mentioned in the introduction, I did 2 of my degrees here. And so I never took this class, but I did come to some of these Friday readings back when I was a student. So it kind of brings everything full circle. So I think I'll start out by just talking about a little bit about the book. And then I'll read a few selections. So I started this book as my MFA thesis, and I have history in coal mining. My grandfather was a coal miner when he was a young man. Ultimately, he got an education and actually for a while was the academic vice president here at BYU. And so he kind of crossed a big kind of chasm in his life between where he started and where he ended. And so I grew up on stories about coal mining as a child, and it was something that my ancestors did. It was something that people did in the past. And so in 2006, when I was walking through the airport, it talks about this in the introduction of the book, I saw this news flash from the Sago mine when there were 13 miners trapped there, and I all of a sudden realized that coal mining was something that people still did. In my bags, incidentally, that year I had a book of genealogy that my uncle had compiled. And I went home and I read all of the stories that I'd heard since I was a child. And they just really, I connected with them in a way that I hadn't before after seeing the news report on these people waiting to find out if their loved ones had been rescued. And so that's how the book started. And then from there, I started doing research. I was going to St. Petersburg that summer, and I decided why not fly into London and go to Spain and go to Wales, in addition to St. Petersburg. I was going for a poetry conference. And so I just showed up in Wales and I started doing research and having experiences that got included in the book. And then I traveled to West Virginia. I went to the small Baptist church where people had waited to find out if their loved ones were rescued. And in the end, I probably ended up doing maybe 2 research trips to Wales, maybe 4 to Utah, maybe 5 to West Virginia, and then 1 to Pennsylvania to kind of pull everything together. And I did lots and lots of research. I still have it. It probably weighs 100 pounds, and then half of it is digital. And so a lot of research went into this book, and kind of my process was to go have experiences, write them down, and just do a lot of research and then start writing. I wrote 1 section of this book after doing all my reading in 1 week. I worked from about 13 hours a day. It was when I wasn't teaching, so it was a good time to work on it. And so that's kind of how I wrote this book. Now, this book has three kind of different techniques in it. And in fact, it covers a lot of ground. It talks about my family history in coal mining. It talks about coal mining today, mostly in West Virginia, both the human and the environmental impact. And then it talks about energy. I lived in DC for about 8 years. And so I was able to interview people there and cover the energy debate. And so it's kind of a wide, kind of coverage of this topic. And then I used kind of three different techniques. And one of those was using my family history and that documentation, and then other historical research and factual information, and then personal narrative. And when I was writing this as a grad student, I almost gave up on it because I just didn't think it was going to work. I didn't know how I was going to pull all of this together and 250 years of history and pull it into a book that people would want to read. And but my MFA advisor encouraged me to keep on going with it, and somehow it came together. I think, just so you know, it took me 13 times. I had to rewrite the introduction before it adequately introduced the book, and then I could take those threads that I'd established in the introduction and weave them through the whole book. And so it was kind of a challenge to pull together. And so what I want to read is actually 3 different sections that kind of highlight a different aspect of the book. The first one is, it's a romantic story. It's a love story between my great grandmother and my great grandpa. And so we're going to start with that. So my great grandfather was named Zephaniah. My great grandmother was named Lily Maud. And Zephaniah's family came from Wales, and so he was born in the United States, but he grew up mining. He started mining when he was 12, and that was the lifestyle that his family had been following for generations. So I'm going to kind of jump in and go with that. Zephaniah inherited some of his mother's disposition and was usually gentle. He never was hot-tempered like his father, but he could be stern in his own way. He wouldn't tolerate the drunkenness of some of his brothers, who accepted the lot of their lives more recklessly. He was the most respected member among his family, careful in his behavior and also his dress. Light on his feet on the dance floor and easy on the eyes. At 21, he was the most sought-after bachelor in Cleveland. And Cleveland is down in central Utah in the coal mining areas. Lily Maud Rencher, after finishing her normal degree at BYU Academy, taught school for a year in St. George, and then moved to the small town of Cleveland to educate the children of farmers and miners. Miss Rencher, called Maud, was a large woman. Her Swedish, Irish, and Welsh background had not blessed her with beauty. At school, she had been a student body officer, and in the words of one of her professors, expressed to my grandfather later, she was kind of a big girl, but wow, could she speak. Maud took the train from Provo, her few dresses packed in a suitcase. Provo was a small town at the time, and Maud had grown up in a farming community. Even so, there must have been just a hint of romanticism in her mind as she struck out into the wild, because in the undeveloped West at that time, mining communities were wild. Confident in her charms, she knew she would endear herself to Cleveland, perhaps not to its most eligible man, whom she fixed her eye on one night at one of the local dances. "Who's the snappy-looking man in the black sateen shirt?" she asked her friends as they clustered in a corner, sizing up the room, pinching their cheeks for color and smoothing their dresses. "Oh, that's Zeph Thomas. Everybody's looking to catch him. He's the oldest and most eligible bachelor in town. You don't have a chance with him." Maud reveled in challenges and told her friends that he would walk her home that night, sealing the deal with a bet. "I know something about you." These were Maud's first words to Zeph, who had probably only taken polite notice of this new school teacher until her bold words jolted him to attention. Zeph was 5'7". She was 2 inches shorter and doubtless a bit wider. She also had freckles, something my grandfather once told me, noticing the sprinkling of little round dots on my 5-year-old nose. "What do you know about me?" Zeph asked, surely leaning forward a little and peering at her. "Oh, something rather interesting," she teased. The rest of the night, Zeph followed her around, trying to pry out her secret, one she must have told him years later. Maud had decided that Zeph would fall in love with her that night. She was her father's favorite and was accustomed to being circled about by listeners. Once he heard her speak, she knew Zeph would not forget her easily. Maud taught in Cleveland for 3 years, during which there was no record of Zeph and Maud's courtship. A prolific letter writer, Maud must have shared the details with her friends and her family. None of these letters have survived, and for some unknown reason, Maud and Zeph never shared these experiences with her posterity. 3 years after Maud and Zeph first danced, Maud returned to BYU alone for a course in public speaking, and then accepted a post in Bunkerville, Nevada, over 300 miles away from Cleveland. Here, in a small outpost of the descendants of LDS pioneers, Maud taught school for another 3 years. The summers were so hot that the whole town would leave their homes and shops and lie in the irrigation ditches to cool off. Under the dry sun in Bunkerville, Maud fell in love with Joseph Walker, a co-worker who was preparing to attend medical school. They became engaged, but Maud finally broke it off because she did not believe he was spiritually minded. At the age of 30, she returned to Utah. Now 28, Zeph worked in the Sunnyside mine as a boss driver, supervising the movement of coal from room to room as it was shuttled along the tracks by mules. During Maud's 3-year absence, Zeph and Maud must have kept in touch, developing the relationship they had begun 7 years previously at a community dance. When Maud arrived, Zeph met her in Salt Lake City, and they married on June 10th, 1911. And so in this selection, I've used our family's historical records in order to put it together. The conversation that I've used is the conversation that was preserved in our historical record. And so that was one of my sources and one of the ways. And you'll also notice there's some description in there. It's one of the challenging things writing about something that's happened in the past. You weren't there. And so in order to kind of fill out the text and make it interesting, you can suppose some details, and there's some words like that you can use, such as possibly, perhaps, in order to let the writer know that you're making some speculations. And so that's the first selection I'm going to read. The second one is one of the grittiest parts of the book, and I've actually never read it at a reading before, but I decided to read it today because I think it presents some of the challenges that you have when you're writing about history. History, from the moment you put it down, is political. The person who writes it has a reason for writing it. They have a point of view, they have a bias. And so that's the challenge with history when you're trying to, as somebody several, years later, trying to write about events, you're writing with sources that are biased. And so how do you deal with that? And so the selection that I want to read is actually after Maud and Zephaniah got married, they lived in Castlegate. They were there for the explosion of 1924. It was the 5th worst explosion in history. Zephaniah was only saved because a blacksmith called him about his son's bike right as he was about ready to step into the mine. But he was a foreman, and he was responsible for all the men that went into the mine that day. He gave them their piece of paper to work, and he sent the married men into the mine because it was a time when coal production was really low, and he wanted them to have money to feed their families. And so he felt very responsible for that because of all the miners that died, and because of that, they had decided to leave mining. Maud wanted to farm. She'd grown up on a farm, and she never liked mining. But the incident that finally convinced Zephaniah and Maud to leave Carbon County was actually this particular experience. And this one was hard to write about because, again, there are different accounts because it's a very divisive historical happening. And so as I read, maybe you can kind of notice what I try to do in order to deal with it in a fair way because I had kind of conflicting sources. 6 months after the explosion in Castlegate, the unity that had been developed by the collective tragedy was ripped apart. Strangers drove into the neighboring town of Helper and erected a cross on the hill. This was the first of the burning crosses in Carbon County, where the Ku Klux Klan began to recruit members. The Greeks, the Italians, and Slavs in these communities formed spy networks to unhood Klan members and erect flaming circles on the hills in opposition to the crosses. My grandfather, Robert, was 6 at the time, and he mentioned these in the troubled recollections of his childhood. I can't remember precisely how old I was when I saw my first fiery cross burning a few hundred yards up the mountain to the rear of our house. I could barely discern the hooded clan figures near it, but from the despairing look on my father's face as he too watched, I sensed all the ugliness, bigotry, and hatred that the flaming crosses carried. An Italian girl of about the same age who is remembered in the historical record as Joe Barboglio's daughter interpreted the burning crosses similarly. However, to her they had a more personal application. She knew that they meant that there were people who hated us and all the other foreign-born families. That she is noted as Joe Barboglio's daughter is significant. After the treatment of Italians in the 1903-1904 strike, Joe Barboglio left Castlegate and settled his family in Helper. He became a noteworthy member of that community and helped found the Helper State Bank. In 1925, racial hatred hit a climax. Milton Burns, a company official, was allegedly killed by Robert Marshall, an African-American miner. The June 15 incident is still a divisive issue in Carbon County, so even current historians retell the story with different slants, some emphasizing the culpability of Marshall and others focusing on the violent reaction of the community. Milton Burns was the special agent for the Utah Fuel Company assigned to keep the peace and enforce company policy. He was a native of the area, a former sheriff, and the father of 6 children, and a man who was immensely popular with the locals. The children especially loved him because he would give them rides on his large gray horse as he made the rounds. It was commonly known, however, that Burns was a Klan member. Prior to the shooting, Marshall had an argument with Burns, and another company official had drawn his time, quit, and received his paycheck. Later that day, Marshall hid under a wagon bridge and confronted Burns as he was making his rounds of the company site. According to 2 small boys, the sole eyewitnesses to the case, when Burns tried to take Marshall's rifle from him, Marshall shot him 5 times, stomped him in the face, and fled. Burns died the following evening and, according to some accounts, identified his killer. A 40-man posse was sent out after Marshall, who was discovered 3 days later in the shack he shared with another black miner. His housemate has turned him in for the $250 reward. According to the 1925 Price Utah Sun Advocate, Marshall was considered a bad actor, having already put bullets into both a girl in roll-up and another black man named Raz Jackson in Grand County. After apprehending Marshall, company officials drove him down to the Price courthouse. There, an angry mob of local citizens seized Marshall from the car and drove him, in a caravan 100 cars long, 3 miles to the hanging tree east of Price. They strung Marshall up, lifting him 35 feet into the air, where he dangled for almost 10 minutes until someone suggested that he be shot. But the crowd yelled, "No, let him suffer." The deputies tried to put Marshall back into the police car, but he was wrested from their hold once more and hung again, this time being jerked around until he died from a broken neck. A reporter from the Sun Advocate indicated that the crowd wasn't the typical one you'd expect for a group of lynchers. Your neighbors, your friends, the tradespeople with whom you are wont to barter day by day, public employees, folks prominent in the church and social circles, and your real conception of a mob might have undergone a radical turnover. No attempt at concealment was made by any member of the lynching party. There was quite a sprinkling of women, the wives and mothers of the good folks of the town, and too, there were even some children. One man bragged about attending the lynching, claiming, "It's a proud day for me that I helped pull the rope." Someone took pictures of the hanging and the crowd gathered around. These were reprinted as a package of postcards and sold door to door for 25 cents. Under pressure from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Governor George Stern issued 11 warrants for the arrest of some of the most prominent citizens in Castlegate for first-degree murder. At the trial, over 100 witnesses refused to identify them as the perpetrators, and all were released without charge. It wasn't until 1998, on what locals call a day of reconciliation, that Marshall was given a funeral service and a proper burial. In 1925, the African-American residents of Carbon County, numbering over just 100, had taken up a collection to bury Marshall, but they lacked the funds to put up a gravestone. The plaque erected in 1998 reads, "Robert Marshall, lynched June 18, 1925, a victim of intolerance. May God forgive." Marshall was the last man to be lynched in the American West. So again, kind of a gritty story. It was probably the most difficult one that I had to write about in my historical research because, again, there isn't total consensus on what happened. And so, again, I tried to give the events of what happened according to different sources and let the reader come up with their own, kind of assessment of what happened. And again, this was the event that my great-grandfather, Zephaniah, he was from Welsh descent, but he was a man known for his fairness. He never favored the Welsh miners that he assigned. And so this was really devastating for him. And his wife, Maud, was very educated. And so they just, after the trauma of the explosion and then this, they just didn't feel like they could stay. They tried to farm. It didn't work out. Zephaniah tried to get a job at Geneva Steel. That didn't work out either. So eventually they ended up moving to Coosbury, Oregon, and starting actually a really primitive mine there. And that's where my grandfather actually grew up mining, was in Coosbury, Oregon. They had to bring coal into the town, and sometimes a truck would stop and there was coal falling out the back. And so it was always really embarrassing for them in high school because they got seen by their classmates hauling coal into town. The last selection that I'm going to share is actually very different. We're going to leave Carbon County and go to West Virginia. And this selection is an example of narrative writing because I'm talking about the experience that I had there when I first went out to the Sago Baptist Church. Again, the Sago Baptist Church is where people waited because it's about a quarter mile from the mine where the accident happened. It's just right over the railroad tracks. There's a little bridge and you're right there. And it's this tiny little church, like snuggled in this, it's kind of maybe a ravine between two small hills and very, very rural. And so it was kind of a real interesting experience for me to be able to go back there and spend some time with coal miners. And so, I had some fun experiences there and some kind of funny ones. And so to lighten things up after reading that Grudy account, I'm going to read this one. And in order to, so I don't have a press pass. I'm not a journalist. And so what do you do when you want to do research and you don't have a press pass and you want people to talk to you? Well, I read a lot of newspapers and I got names from newspapers and then I called people. I just cold called them and I asked them if they would talk to me. When I was in Wales, I wanted to tour a coal mine and it was the last deep coal mine in Wales and I just wanted to see it before it closed because I had such a connection with coal mining in Wales. And so I just climbed under the fence and started walking around, and then a guy drove up in a bus and asked me what I was doing there. And I said, well, I'm Erin Thomas and my ancestors were coal miners, here in Wales. I just had to see this place before it closed down. And so he gave me a tour. So much of my research happened in kind of that sort of shooting from the hip way. And so Pastor Wees Day is a pastor of Sago Baptist Church, and I found his name in a newspaper and I called him. And I asked him if I could come and visit his church. And he said yes. And it was an interesting conversation because he's hard of hearing. And so, I just ended up driving out there one Sunday to attend their service. So I'm going to start with a little bit of description, and then I'm going to jump to where Pastor Day comes in. I stayed there for the Sunday school services, and then I'm going to actually read it through. I think I have enough time. All right. Worship service hadn't started yet, so I walked up the hillside next to the church and read names on old graves. Later, stepping into the lobby, I noticed, hung just over the chapel, an oil painting of a coal miner bending over a Bible, reading with the light of his headlamp. A note scrawled on a scrap of paper was pinned to the bulletin board. To the Sago Baptist Church and Pastor Wees Day. I was so touched by the generosity of your church showed during this tragedy with the mine. Please accept this statue from a fellow Christian and a miner's daughter. It was signed by a woman from Clarksburg. Her gift was placed on the oak table below, a statue of Jesus laying his hand on a miner carved out of anthracite, the densest grade of coal, hard to ignite, slow to burn. The Romans were the first to carve it, digging it out of wells and carrying it back to Rome, where they polished it into jewelry. They called it jet, missing entirely the full potential of coal and what it would mean to empire. While in Wales, I purchased a small statue of a young mining boy in anthracite for my Grandma Thomas. It reminded me of my grandpa's stories of the mines in his youth, but especially of 6-year-old Evan. That was my great-great-grandfather. He started mining in Wales when he was 6. There was something intriguing about the image of a miner being carved from coal, and a savior being cut from the same material to redeem him. This black rock has had so much influence in shaping our modern world, but also in shaping mining communities and the people in them. Coal is much more than a job. It defines an entire culture. A lean, medium-sized man with slouching shoulders and a gray mustache spotted me through the doors of the chapel as I browsed through the lobby. I looked away, suddenly self-conscious for snooping. He walked to the doors and opened one side to invite me in. I thanked him and sat in the back pew. In the rows ahead, men sat in checked wool and flannel. Their rolled-up sleeves rested on the bulge of their biceps. Their wives wore jumpers. Some had hair that was curled and permed, fluffed out in the style of the 1980s. Several, I guessed, were near my age, but they looked older, motherly. I hadn't followed my friend's advice about jeans. I was wearing a brown corduroy skirt and a t-shirt, an outfit I thought would be appropriately casual. But it was totally wrong for the congregation. My black Soho-style glasses immediately marked me as an East Coaster. A flower wreath near the podium in the front honored one of the killed miners, sent to the small community by another conserved individual. Dick, the man who invited me in, started the service. The former lead elder, Martin Toller Jr., had been among the 12 killed in the mine. Dick first solicited the congregation for names to be included in the prayers. Members spoke out. Mumbles of assent and nods followed each request for remembrance. For Gus with kidney stones. Praise the Lord for our son with hepatitis. His enzymes come down. The Burr family, their grandfather passed away. My neighbors got cancer. And we need to remember our pastor. We should always remember him. The Sago mining disaster hadn't been this town's first tragedy, and as I listened to each plea for help, I knew it wouldn't be their last. Members of the congregation rose and knelt at a stoop before the podium, praying out loud as the music played. The words "blessed" and "O Lord" rose and slipped back into the hum of voices. Sunday school preceded worship service and focused on the gifts of the Spirit, a series of passages found in 1 Corinthians 12 in the Bible. Dick led the discussion. Members spoke out when they had something to add. It's because of my faith that I'm here, a man declared from the middle. From the pews across came a reply, but the Phillipses ain't here. They had a barbecue this weekend, one woman piped up. Yeah, they're probably really tired, another person mentioned. The beef was really good, a man exclaimed, and several in the congregation chuckled. Dick smiled and reeled the discussion back into Corinthians. Occasionally, one of the older men from the back broke out into irrelevant pearls of wisdom. God can do it, and if he does it, it is to his glory. Godly people die every day, and somehow their dying is to his glory. Toward the end of the Sunday school, Reverend Day walked in, a large man with extremely white hair, and began to shake hands down the aisles. He had the look of a preacher, a broad smile, a large, sharply cut triangular nose, and a pot belly that pressed out against his iron white shirt, where it was tucked into his trousers. He shook my hand, asking, "This your first time?" Reverend Day took... I'm going to read this part. Children trailed in. There was only one young woman in the entire congregation, and she held the hand of the only young man. There were around 70 members in attendance, and I was struck by what an absence 12 men would create in a town like Sago. We sang an opening hymn. Ann Castle led, the cousin of Marty Bennett, who was killed in the mine. I had been singing every weekend in LDS congregation since I was a small child, but even this experience set me apart. I sang it straight. The congregation added twang. My music came out clean, and theirs feelingly. Reverend Day took the stand. He announced that my grandfather was a coal miner and I was here to visit. Several people turned, and the men with rolled-up sleeves nodded their heads at me. Reverend Day led into a sermon in true revival style. If I shut up, I'm going to blow up. First and foremost is love. It all boils down to love. Reverend Day worked in circles of reasoning. The logic wound and looped back in spurts. But as he talked, I felt the spirit, the warmness and pure light that accompanies sincere talk of deity. Behind the Reverend hung a tapestry of the Last Supper, and he picked up where Sunday school left off. In 1 Corinthians 12, it talks about the body of Christ. Now the spirit is strong, but the body is weak. There's times when the old flesh is wore out. But when one member suffers, we all suffer with it. If there were 50 piano players and nobody knowed how to sing, what would you do? Plumbers, miners, all as good as the preacher. If you plugged your ears, you can't hear. You're all a part of the family of Christ. He stopped now and then to offer spontaneous prayer to anyone who hasn't accepted Christ. I knew he meant me, the only stranger in the congregation. I had told him that my grandpa Thomas mined in Utah, and it was possible he'd concluded I was Mormon, or he might just have considered me a college-educated woman from the East, a relatively godless region. Either way, Reverend Day believed I wasn't Christian. He built up the emotion, prepping the congregation for a miracle. I just preach as it comes to me, he admitted, and continued with stories of sick widows and funerals, careening back to the conclusion of love and being a witness of Christ. Reverend Day grew up in Sago and moved back 10 years ago when he was called by the Lord to be a preacher. He drives a bus to supplement his income. He looks 70, only 20 years younger than my grandfather would be. His salary was small. The church budget was read over the pulpit earlier in the service. As Reverend Day talked about his interactions with his parishioners in the little white chapel he had helped raise money for and build, I understood why he had returned. At the end of the sermon, we sang Amazing Grace, a song the Reverend claimed to sing while he did his physical therapy. I noticed with some self-consciousness that the whole congregation could probably hear my voice, so different a melody it produced than their own. But this song was special to me, too. My family sang it the day we learned my older brother had terminal brain cancer, and although I sang it with my church voice, I sang it feelingly. The Reverend prayed again for the anonymous Jesus-less among them. Everyone knew he meant me. He asked the congregation to close their eyes. Anybody who is ready to accept Christ, raise your hand, he commanded. I kept my hands folded loosely in my lap. He made one last attempt. Erin, do you have anything to say? Maybe these people needed some dramatic conversion, some good to come out of their loss, the reclamation of a stranger to the bosom of Christ. I wanted them to have their miracle, but I couldn't give him that. No, I don't, I answered. A man with a handlebar mustache laughed out loud. Well, thanks for coming, Reverend Day conceded. Thanks for having me, I smiled back. So, just some things I want to point out about writing something like this. So, obviously, you don't want to show up and have a notebook and be writing down everything somebody says, because it's just really impolite and it puts people, at ill at ease if they don't know that they're being interviewed. If they know they're being interviewed, you can bring a recorder and take notes, and it's fine. And so, so when you put your writer hat on, you experience things differently. And I think in some ways it's a shame because you're always looking for kind of the writer's experience when you go as a writer. But you try to notice small details about people so you can describe them in 3 or 4 words in such a way that you can create a mental picture for your audience. So that's one thing you notice. You notice details about people, the way they talk, the way they express themselves. And you make mental notes of that in your head. And then when people are talking, you listen to what they say, you listen to how they say it, and you make mental notes of that in your head. And when you're writing, of course, you're not going to include all of an experience because not all of it's interesting and not all of it pertains to what you're writing about. So that's part of the editing process is what do you include and what do you not? Because in nonfiction, you're not making it up, but you're telling a story. And so you have to be selective. And so I was, all the things that happened in that meeting are included in this narrative. It's a couple pages. It was, I was there for at least an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. And so that's part of the process. After I left, this is what I do if I wasn't in a situation where I was interviewing people. I brought my notebook in my car, and I get in my car and I write down everything that I could remember, just absolute brain dump. And again, you're taking note of what people say and how they say it, what they look like, their small gestures that might be interesting and fill out something. Because then later when you go to actually write the selection, you're not going to remember those things. So it's really important to annotate those. So I think I'm going to end there with the book. There's a couple things I wanted to address before I open up for questions. And the first is just, if you want to be a writer, I want to talk about the discipline of writing. And along that lines, I wanted to share a poem that my father sent to me. It's by Kenneth Koch, and it's called You Want a Social Life with Friends. You want a social life with friends, a passionate love life as well, to work hard every day, What's true is of these three you may have two. There isn't time enough, my friends, though dawn begins yet midnight ends, to find the time to have love, work, and friends. Michelangelo had feeling for Vittoria in the ceiling, but did he go to parties at day's end? Homer Knightley went to banquets, rode all day, but had no lockets bright with pictures of his girl. I know one who loves and parties and has done so since his 30s, but writes hardly anything at all. And so what do you do? I mean, I have a full-time job. I work for IBM right now, and I have 3 book projects. How do you balance all that? What I would say right now as a writing student is figure out your process and make it a regular thing where you sit down to write. Put aside hours to write. When I was a student at BYU, I was studying art, and so I was really busy with that, but I decided that February was my writing month because that's when the writing contests were. And so I would get really ahead on my homework in January, and then I would write all of February, and then I would have to catch up in March with the rest of my homework because I wouldn't do much homework in February other than write. And I did that for all the years I was at BYU, and that was kind of my set-aside time to write. Since graduating, as an MFA student, it was part of my job, quote unquote, to write, and so I had time then. But then when I graduated, I was teaching, and I was an adjunct. And I was teaching about anywhere from 20 to 24 credit hours. And those of you who've taught before know what that means. And so what I would do in order to have time to write is I would go on social retreat. And so for a month, I would tell all my friends that I was not going to spend time with them, and I would go to work, and I would come home, and I'd write every day. And sometimes I did that. One year I did that 4 times. So there were 4 months of that year that I did not do any socializing, and I just did writing. And so if you want to be a writer, there's a lot of people that want to write books, and most of them won't write books. And the reason is because writing books is hard. And once you write a book, you realize that writing a book isn't the hard part. The hard part is selling a book, finding an agent and a press. And then after you sell a book, you realize that's not the hard part. The hard part is marketing your book. And so writing books is hard. And so if you want to be a writer, start now taking time to set aside for that and make it part of your routine. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, especially to this audience, it's a question I had in my mind. I was really afraid when I actually started my MFA program because I thought that I was going to go inactive. I thought, oh no, I'm going to become a writer, and I'm going to leave the church. And because, so we've got a really rich kind of interchurch literary tradition, but in terms of, kind of the mainstream literary quote-unquote market, we're just starting to have a presence. And so how do you negotiate that, being a Mormon and being a writer? When I was studying my MFA, it was something that came up a lot, me being Mormon, with my classmates and with my professors, and it was an anomaly. It was, And I'd be writing about food, and people would want to know if we prayed over the food. And I was always so annoyed because I just felt like it had nothing to do with what I was talking about. And I had this professor. He was a young professor. He was mostly helping me with my thesis. And I was telling him about this, and he said, you know what, Erin? He's like, you're a Mormon. It's a fact. He's like, treat it like a fact and then move on. And so in writing this book, I workshopped a lot of it during my MFA. People had a lot of questions, and a lot of those questions weren't really relevant to what I was writing about. And so I just treated it like a fact, and I moved on. And I found that that was kind of the best way to negotiate that space. At AWP one year, I went to a presentation. It was on religion and writing, and all the authors that presented there could only approach their respective religions with an amount of skepticism. And I guess what I found is that that's not really necessary. You can be a good writer and a good Mormon, and it just doesn't need to get more complicated than that. I think the biggest thing is just being honest with both of those things and treating it like a fact, and then, kind of moving on. So that's what I had to say. We've got about 15 minutes, and so if you have questions, go for it. Go ahead, right there.
In your writing, do you find that there's a line between fact and fiction? You say because you're writing about real things, but you're leaving things out. And
That's a really good question, and that's one of the major dilemmas of creative nonfiction. What is that? And what part is creative? Is it just the technique that we use to write creative nonfiction, or is some of our nonfiction creative? So I guess one thing we talked about a lot in my MFA program is kind of the parameters of that. When can you include information that's supposed to be factual that's not true? And what we came down to is that you don't invent people. You don't create people that don't exist. You don't invent events that didn't happen. But when you're writing creative nonfiction, you're telling a story. So naturally, there's some things that maybe you have to speculate about. And when you're writing about those things, you use words like perhaps. And that way you can kind of fill out the story, bring some detail to it without falsifying information. And like you said, we're not recording exactly what happened. And in that sense, history itself is not a record of every minute that occurred in history. There's always a point of view and a bias, as I mentioned before. And so creative nonfiction certainly has that in common with history. But I think within certain parameters, you're dealing with memory. You're not only dealing with your memory of things, you're dealing with other people's memory. And so I think at the outset, you just accept that maybe there's some room, I guess, for things that are maybe not totally factual, but you do your best. You're writing nonfiction, and so you do your best to be as factual as possible. Go ahead.
You spoke about, was it father or grandfather, someone who began in coal mining and came to BYU as vice president?
Yes, that was my grandfather.
How did he do it? How did he bridge that? How did he cross that chasm?
His mother was very educated, and so she raised them with kind of the standard works of literature. And his brothers all pulled together. They worked each other through college, and so one wouldn't go and the other two would go to college, and then kind of they traded off that way. So their parents died when they were all in their 20s, and so they didn't have a lot of financial support from their parents. But yeah, and so they just did that. My grandfather worked at the docks when he was getting he worked 2 shifts at the docks when he was getting his bachelor's degree. And so just through hard work and perseverance. But they knew they could, they had the ability to do it because their mother had raised them to be educated men. Over here.
You mentioned attending the church, and you read that piece. Did they know you were working on a book at the time?
Pastor Day did. The rest of the congregation didn't. Initially, I thought I would go and interview people who had lost people in the mining accident, but I found that I couldn't do that. And it was out of respect for them, but also I just didn't want to dig up. A lot of them had been interviewed by journalists about it, and I felt like in some ways that was sufficient. And so sometimes I relied on other sources, not because I couldn't interview people, but because out of a sense of like maintaining people's privacy and not having them being, just overwhelmed by the media attention, because it's a very small town. I mean, in West Virginia, very just small. And so you don't want to come and shove yourself into people's sorrow, I guess. Go ahead.
Sort of an extra literary question. How were you able to parlay your MFA into a job in, quote, the real world?
That's a very good question. So I was an adjunct for 2 years, and I told you before how many credit hours I taught. And after 2 years, it just didn't seem to be something that was economically feasible. Most people don't make any money writing books, just FYI. So write books because you want to write books, not because you're going to make money at it. And so I ultimately, I hope to go back to teaching. You have to have a couple books. So I'm hopefully going to publish another one. I've got 2 other projects. So everybody cross your fingers. But right now I work for IBM. I learned how to edit after years of teaching and years of writing. And so I've edited for them and I write marketing materials. And so actually most of my writing for work now is technical communication. And so it does translate to that. And so I don't know. It's difficult with English. You study it because you love it, but then what do you do going forward? And there are career opportunities, but not necessarily directly related to creative writing always.
Just a follow up. So how did you get the first job?
Oh, at IBM?
Yeah.
Fell on my lap. I got a friend recommended me for the position, and so that's kind of how I got into business. But I was thinking at the time that maybe I needed to cut over into business communications for a while. So, any other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, could you tell me a little bit about the process of writing a rough draft and then revising it? What I'm wondering about is when you write, do you tend to write a lot more than you end up with as a final product, or do you tend to write less and then fill out some details? Or can you talk a little bit about
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm glad you brought it up. Okay, so first thing with writing, assume everything you write the first time is not very good. And so, and that's, I think, like the best kind of assumption when you're writing a rough draft is that what you start out with is not going to be great, and you don't attach ego to it, and you don't worry, because basically you're just trying to get the information on the page and like roughly hash out a structure. And so, yeah, I read a lot. I read a ton before I start writing, and then I put all my books away, and then I start writing. And I just write. And what I write is absolute gibberish, and it's for pages, and I can never show it to anybody else because it wouldn't make a whit of sense. And then I go back and I start refining. I pull back out my books. I start using quotes from the books and facts if I couldn't remember things exactly. And I start filling it out that way. But I go through lots of drafts. And again, with what I start with, like, it's not any good. And so I write it and I write it and I write it until it's good, and adding information, pulling information away. But one thing, I wrote a lot more than the other students did in my MFA. Like, they had about maybe 70 pages of essays, and I had 180 pages of text. And the reason for that, I think, was two things, and that was just, not worrying about first drafts, like how they are, if they're any good, and just like dumping out all the information on the page. And the other thing is just, again, not attaching a lot of like ego to your first drafts and having to be good the first time. I feel like as a writer, a good writer is like, and there are writers that we read about that get poems in their head and then just write them down and they're perfect. But I think most of us have to go through a lot of drafts. And so just being open to the process of writing, I think, is like really important. And as it develops and as your text gets better, and giving yourself time to rewrite. My second book that I'm working on, I thought it was done 3 times. I just rewrote it for the 3rd time. Now finally I'm feeling better about it, and so it's just kind of the way it rolls. Here and then here.
What about citation when you're dealing with historical events? Do you use citation in a works cited, or do you use footnotes? How do you establish the sources for the more factual historical claims?
So I kept records of all of those. In creative nonfiction, you have a little bit more flexibility with what you are kind of able to, with your citation. You don't have to cite every source, which is a good thing, because some paragraphs I had like 8 sources for, and it would have been really burdensome in a creative nonfiction book to have that many numbers. But you keep track of all your sources. At the end of my book, I have an abbreviated like kind of bibliography that lets people know where I got my information in sections. And so that's how I kept track of it. But I think it's always important to hang on to it and know where you got your stuff, just to make sure it's accurate in case you have to fact check later. And then also in case somebody writes you and wonders where you got some information. So yeah, it's more flexible than straight out historical nonfiction writing, but it's still, it's nonfiction. So there's a need for keeping track of your sources. There's a question back there.
Yeah, when you're writing, do you tend to just go through and edit what you're doing, or do you open a new document, completely rewrite the same section?
I usually work from what I have, so I usually work from my brain dump, and then I'll just cut and paste and move things around and refine. Sometimes I get overwhelmed because I have so much crap and I'm trying to find the good stuff out of it. So then sometimes I'll cut and paste things from my first document into a new document because I need a clean page, and then write from there. So it just really depends. It depends how long I've been working that day and how well I can think. But sometimes I paste into new documents and work off there, especially if I'm working on a long work. Sometimes I just can't deal with like 100 pages of text on the page at once, and so I'll paste into smaller. I do a lot of cut and pasting different places and moving things around and deleting and adding in my process. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure to come and talk to you, and I'm sure I'll have a chance to talk to some of you after.